Quidonia Airfield, Rome, June 1943. Engineer Capo Filippo Zapata wiped the sweat from his brow as he circled the captured aircraft gleaming under the Mediterranean sun. The twin-boom American fighter sat beneath armed guard, its aluminum skin unmarred except for a few scratches from its emergency landing in Sardinia 3 days earlier. A navigation error had gifted Italy something no amount of intelligence or espionage could have delivered: a completely intact Lockheed P-38G Lightning, both Allison engines still warm from the flight north. At first glance, the machine offended every instinct of Italian elegance. Its awkward geometry, twin tails flanking a central nacelle, broke all the rules of symmetry and grace. Pilots at the airfield laughed, calling it Il Diavolo, a due code, the twin-tailed devil. The nickname carried mockery, not awe. But as Zapata began his methodical inspection, his skepticism gave way to unease. Every rivet, every curve, every junction of alloy seemed born from a philosophy far beyond form or style. This wasn't guesswork or improvisation. This was engineering as prophecy. He ran his hand along the left boom, tracing where the turbo supercharger exhaust exited in a perfect arc. The tolerances were impossibly tight. The wiring was labeled. The coolant routing was balanced with mathematical precision. It was a level of standardization and foresight no Italian or even German workshop could yet match. Zapata stepped back, notebook in hand, the summer air thick with engine oil and disbelief. The P-38 wasn't ungainly, it was inevitable. And the numbers scrawled in his ledger whispered an unbearable truth. Italy's engineers weren't behind by a few months. They were behind by years. The twin-tailed devil, he realized, wasn't a mistake of design. It was the future, and it had just landed in enemy hands. The following morning, the hangar at Quidonia Airfield was sealed off. Only a handful of Italy's top engineers were allowed inside, and even they had to surrender notebooks before entering. A captured American aircraft was a rare gift, but an intact one was a state secret. Filippo Zapata stood at the center of the hangar floor, his eyes fixed on the P-38's left engine nacelle. The sun filtered through high windows, falling across the gleaming twin booms. Technicians wheeled over a maintenance ladder and began unfastening the cowling. The clink of wrenches echoed through the cavernous space. When the aluminum panels finally came loose, every conversation stopped. Inside lay the beating heart of the Lightning, a 12-cylinder Allison V1710 engine, liquid-cooled, supercharged, and meticulously laid out like a work of art. There was no clutter, no wasted motion, no hidden bolts buried beneath components. Each system was arranged for clarity and access. Zapata leaned in, his pencil scratching furiously across the paper. "Look at the fuel line routing," he murmured to his assistant. "No sharp bends, no excess length. They've balanced pressure distribution across both banks." He motioned for a caliper, measuring the turbo supercharger casing. It was compact, tightly integrated, and directly driven. Not a bulky add-on as with German designs. "It's small," muttered another engineer. "Too small for such output." Zapata smirked. "It's efficient. They've built power into discipline." Then came the real shock. He traced the engine mounts and found them made of forged steel alloy, light, resilient, and easy to replace. Bolts of standardized size, components interchangeable from one aircraft to another. It was production design at a level that Fiat or Alfa Romeo could only dream of. He stepped back and gestured to the P-38's twin-boom layout. "They've solved cooling by design, not by brute force. The airflow splits symmetrically. Each engine gets perfect circulation without adding drag." The others nodded reluctantly. They had seen German innovations. The Messerschmitt's sleek fuselage, the Focke-Wulf's powerful radial engines, but nothing so harmonized between form and function. Zapata pulled off his gloves, voice low. "They've built this like a machine to win a war of factories, not just battles." He turned toward the tail section next. The dual boom design that had seemed so absurd now revealed its genius. Maintenance access panels opened with simple latches. Control linkages were clean, direct, and modular. Even the hydraulic lines were labeled, each one marked with English text and directional arrows for flow. "Imagine," he muttered, "an aircraft that can be repaired by any mechanic in the field, in hours. Ours must be sent back to the factory." His assistant hesitated. "But the Germans," Zapata interrupted, "believe complexity equals superiority." This, he tapped the P-38's metal skin, proves the opposite. They moved to the cockpit next. The controls were simple, tactile, and shockingly ergonomic. Switches were arranged by instinct, not ornament. The pilot's seat was bolted onto a rail for quick removal. Instruments glowed with English markings, each gauge clear and legible. Zapata stared in silence, His mind returned to the countless Italian test flights ruined by mechanical failures, leaking coolant, jammed hydraulics, overheating engines. The Americans had found the answer not in brilliance, but in reliability. As the evening light slanted across the hangar floor, Zapata closed his notebook. "Gentlemen," he said finally, "we have seen the future, and it is not Italian. It is American." No one spoke. The twin-boomed fighter stood silent in the fading sun, its silver frame reflecting like a mirror showing a nation's limits. That night, as Zapata left the hangar, the P-38 gleamed behind him like a ghost of the industrial age Italy would never catch. 2 days later, the P-38 was towed onto the airstrip under the strictest secrecy. Its olive-drab paint was scarred and faded, but its structure remained flawless, twin booms stretching like wings of steel across the tarmac. The early morning mist hung low, muffling the sound of tools and distant engines. Filippo Zapata stood beside the aircraft with his clipboard, his face lined with exhaustion and fascination. Every hour since the inspection, his engineers had begged permission to start the engines, to see if the monster still breathed. Today, the approval came through, and the airbase gathered silently to watch. "Prime the fuel," Zapata ordered. The mechanic twisted the lever, and the first Allison engine coughed, sputtered, then erupted into a deep mechanical growl that reverberated through the hangars. A moment later, the second engine followed, both roaring in perfect synchronization. The air shimmered with heat waves from the twin exhausts. One Italian officer muttered under his breath, "It sounds alive." Zapata didn't answer. He leaned forward, eyes fixed on the gauges. Oil pressure stable, temperature rising smoothly. No rattles, no smoke. It was as if the machine had never been idle. He turned toward the assembled engineers. "Notice the idle stability," he said, raising his voice over the roar. "No vibration imbalance. Both propellers pitch themselves automatically. It doesn't even need constant correction." The Germans stationed at the field looked on with a mixture of curiosity and unease. One of them, a Luftwaffe observer, frowned. "Our twin-engine Bf-110s shake like carts at low speed," he said quietly. "This one hums like an electric motor." After 20 minutes of ground testing, Zapata made the call. "We take her up." Gasps rippled through the small crowd. "You can't!" one officer exclaimed. "We haven't cleared it!" Zapata's voice was steady. "Then we'll learn nothing." Moments later, a test pilot, Lieutenant Carlo Bianchi, climbed into the cockpit. Zapata handed him the notes. "Keep it under 3,000 meters. Gentle turns, no dives." Bianchi nodded, strapped in, and the canopy slammed shut. The twin propellers blurred, the lightning surged forward, and with a deafening roar, it leapt into the air. The P-38 climbed effortlessly, banking into the morning haze. Its silver wings glinted in the sun as it looped once over the airfield. Below, Zapata shaded his eyes, watching in disbelief as the aircraft performed turns smoother than any Italian fighter. "Stability like a bird," Bianchi's voice crackled through the radio. "It feels static, balanced, perfectly balanced." The test lasted only 10 minutes, but it was enough. When the Lightning touched down, its engines ticking softly as they cooled, the pilot climbed out, face pale with awe. "This," he said quietly, "flies like it knows what it's doing." Zapata walked to the nose of the aircraft, placing his hand on its metal skin. He felt the faint warmth, the whisper of something beyond engineering, foresight. He turned to his assistants. "It doesn't fight the air," he said. "It works with it." Every part of this machine was designed by men who understood the pilot's struggle. Not just engineers, pilots themselves. Then, looking toward the horizon where smoke from distant Allied bombers smudged the sky, Zapata muttered, "And that's why we will lose. They build for the man. We build for the machine." The other engineers said nothing. The truth was undeniable. The twin-tailed devil had not just flown, it had humbled them. As the sun set over Quidonia, the P-38 rested on the runway like a symbol of everything the Axis had underestimated: efficiency, simplicity, and human-centered design. In that silence, Italy's finest engineer realized they weren't studying an airplane. They were studying the end of an era. The next morning, Filippo Zapata arrived at the hangar before dawn. The air smelled of oil, metal, and desert dust carried from the south. The P-38 sat beneath the slatted skylights, its twin booms glinting faintly in the half-light like the ribs of some sleeping creature. Every test so far had defied expectation, but today, Zapata wanted answers, mathematical ones. He removed his jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and motioned for his team to bring the instruments. Dial gauges, thermocouples, torque wrenches, all laid out like surgical tools. "Today," he told them quietly, "we see what kind of heart drives this beast." They began by draining the oil and disassembling one of the Allison V1710 engines. The Italians had worked on plenty of power plants before. The elegant Alfa Romeo 135's, the brutish Fiat A74's, but the moment the first Allison cylinder head came off, silence filled the hangar. One mechanic bent closer, running a finger along the polished valve train. "It's clean," he whispered. "No carbon scoring, no wear." Zapata nodded slowly. "It ran hard yesterday, yet it looks brand new." He pulled out his notebook. "Alloys high tensile steel here, aluminum casting thinner than ours, but stronger." "How?" "They weighed a piston, lighter by nearly a third than the Italian equivalent. The bearings, self-lubricating bronze. The fuel injectors, precision machined to tolerances that would take Italian factories weeks to replicate. Every piece fit together with the exactness of clockwork." Zapata straightened, wiping his hands on a rag. "They built this like a car, not a plane engine," he murmured. "It's meant to be produced, not handcrafted. Each one identical to the next." His assistant frowned. "You mean mass production?" Zapata nodded. "Yes. It's not a masterpiece. It's a miracle of repetition. That's the difference." To demonstrate, he held up a spark plug. "Ours are threaded by hand. Look at this. Machine cut, flawless, every groove perfect. They could make thousands a week without a single craftsman." Later that morning, a Luftwaffe liaison officer arrived, Major Kruger, a man whose arrogance filled any room he entered. He adjusted his leather gloves and peered over Zapata's shoulder. "So, Engineer Zapata," he said smugly, "what do you think of our American friends now?" Zapata didn't look up. "I think," he said slowly, "they've solved problems we still don't know how to name." Kruger frowned. "Meaning?" Zapata gestured toward the engine block. "See how the coolant lines are routed? The airflow geometry? Every design decision here was made for simplicity. Any mechanic, even a farmer, could maintain this machine in the field. You don't need specialists, you just need people." Kruger chuckled dismissively. "Field repair is for peasants. German machines are built for perfection." Zapata finally turned to him. "And perfection breaks when a single part fails. This one keeps fighting." The German officer said nothing more. That afternoon, they reassembled the engine and mounted it to a dynamometer borrowed from Fiat's test facility. The roar, when it started, was deafening, a deep, even thunder that shook dust from the rafters. The instruments trembled as the power climbed. 2,400 horsepower, 2,800, 3,200. The needle held steady. No shudder, no backfire, no instability. It simply ran. Zapata's pen stopped mid-note. He removed his glasses, rubbing his eyes. "Madonna mia," he whispered. No Italian engine, not even the top experimental prototypes, had ever reached that output with such stability. Not even close. The men gathered behind him in stunned silence. For the first time, they weren't engineers admiring a rival design. They were witnesses to a new philosophy of warfare. When the test ended, the hangar smelled of hot metal and triumph that wasn't theirs. Zapata stood motionless, staring at the humming engine as it cooled. "This," he said quietly, "isn't just an airplane. It's a factory that flies." He looked up at the P-38's sleek silhouette beyond the hangar door. In that moment, every engineer in the room understood. Italy's war had already ended. They just hadn't been told yet. That evening, as the hangar lights dimmed and the roar of the test engine faded into memory, Filippo Zapata retreated to his office, a cramped, smoke-stained room littered with blueprints, test sheets, and empty espresso cups. The air was thick with exhaustion and quiet awe. On his desk sat a stack of papers: performance logs, fuel efficiency charts, pressure readings, and weight calculations. Each line, each number, was a confession, the confession of a nation left behind. He unrolled the first of many hand-drawn comparison charts. The Italian DB605 engine from the Machi C202 on one side, and the Allison V1710 from the P38 on the other. He had listed everything from compression ratios to thrust curves. As his fountain pen scratched across the paper, a grim pattern emerged. Fuel-to-air ratio. American engine holds stability even at extreme lean mixture. Power loss negligible, he muttered to himself. He turned to another sheet. Mean time between failures, Allison. 180 hours Fiat RA. 1050, barely 60. He sighed and drew a slow line under the numbers. They're not just ahead, they're operating on another plane of thinking. He leaned back, rubbing his temples. The fluorescent light above flickered faintly, casting uneven shadows across the walls lined with technical drawings. He opened a brown envelope marked Confidenziale. Copies of reports from German engineers who had also examined captured P-38 wreckage on the Eastern Front. Their conclusions mirrored his own. Precision beyond comprehension, modular construction, unmatched thermal efficiency. Zapata turned to his assistant, young Enzo Dalmaso, who sat nearby, nervously flipping through a folder of fuel analyses. "Look at this," Zapata said, sliding a graph across the desk. "Our engines need high-octane fuel, but theirs perform almost the same even with lower-grade aviation gasoline. It means their tolerances are perfect. They squeeze power out of imperfection." Enzo frowned. "But how?" "We use the same mathematics, the same equations." Zapata tapped the paper. "No. We use equations to explain what we've built. They use equations to decide what to build. That's the difference." The words hung heavy in the room. Outside, a distant siren wailed. Another Allied air raid somewhere near the coast. The vibration rattled the window panes, but Zapata didn't look up. He continued writing, his pen racing across the paper. He made notes on heat dissipation, lubrication, and manufacturing tolerances, measurements so tight that Italy's factories couldn't match them even with their most skilled labor. The Americans had something Italy didn't. Machines that could think with precision. Faster and truer than human hands, he wrote furiously. Page after page. Thread precision, 0.0015-inch variance, impossible with current Fiat tooling. Alloy mixture implies metallurgical process unavailable in Europe. Engine can be field assembled in under 2 hours. Our equivalent requires a day. By midnight, his desk was a battlefield of numbers, charts, and photographs. In one of the pictures, the Allison engine mounted on the test rig earlier that day. Zapata noticed something small, yet profound. A label stamped near the oil manifold. General Motors Aircraft Division, Detroit, Michigan. He whispered the words under his breath, as if reading the signature of a god. General Motors, not a weapons maker. A car company. He sat back, stunned. The realization hit him harder than the engine's roar had. America hadn't mobilized its war factories to build engines. It had simply adapted its car factories. What Italy considered cutting-edge aviation technology, America considered routine manufacturing. The pencil slipped from his hand. He stared at the chaos of papers before him. Data, notes, sketches, and for the first time in his career, Zapata felt something foreign to a man of science. Despair. He turned to Enzo. "Take these reports to Rome in the morning. Deliver them to the Air Ministry. Tell them," he paused, searching for words. "Tell them they can copy this design if they wish, but they'll never copy how it was built." Enzo hesitated. "And what should I tell them about your conclusion, sir?" Zapata looked at the flickering lamp, its dying light glinting off the scattered papers. "Tell them the Americans have already invented the future. We are only sketching its shadow." By dawn the next day, Zapata's report was already on a military transport headed for Rome. But in the capital, inside the marble halls of the Ministry of Aeronautics, his findings would ignite a storm far greater than he expected. Colonel Vittorio Mazzini, head of the Ufficio Tecnico Superiore, slammed the folder shut and glared at the assembled engineers and officers. "So, according to our chief propulsion expert, the Americans have achieved engineering perfection," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "A car company builds better engines than Italy's finest aircraft manufacturers. Is this a joke?" Silence filled the long conference room. The brass ceiling fans hummed lazily overhead. Across the table sat Zapata himself, summoned to defend his conclusions before the most powerful men in Italy's aviation industry. "It's not perfection, Colonel," Zapata replied quietly, placing his hands on the table. "It's discipline, in design, in manufacturing, in testing. They have standards we can't even measure, let alone match." Mazzini leaned forward. "So you're saying the Italian worker, the Italian engineer, is inferior?" Zapata met his gaze. "No, I'm saying they're under-equipped. Our ideas are good, but ideas without the tools to shape them are just dreams." The colonel smirked, flipping through a page. "You claim their tolerances are within 1,000th of an inch. Impossible. Even our best lathes can't achieve that." "That's exactly my point," Zapata said, voice steady. "Their factories run on automated precision. They use gauges to measure imperfections smaller than the thickness of a human hair. It's not genius, it's infrastructure." Across the table, another official, General Ruggeri of the Regia Aeronautica, interrupted. "Enough talk about tolerances. Tell us about the engines themselves. Is it true the P-38 can fly home on one engine?" Zapata nodded. "Yes, General. The Allison VI 1710 engines operate independently. The cooling, lubrication, and fuel systems are designed to function even if one engine fails completely. During my examination, I found redundant oil pumps and dual ignition circuits, features that ensure reliability in combat." Ruggeri leaned back, impressed despite himself. "Our fighters can barely limp back on half power. Remarkable." Mazzini cut in sharply. "So what do you propose we do?" Copy it? Build our own version? Zapata hesitated. The question was dangerous. We can study it, of course. But without the industrial base, without precision tooling, it would be imitation, not innovation. The colonel laughed bitterly. Then perhaps you should join the Americans, Engineer Zapata. You seem quite enamored with them. The insult stung, but Zapata kept his composure. Admiration for skill is not betrayal, Colonel. It's education. The room went cold. At that moment, an aide entered, delivering a telegram to the general. He unfolded it, read silently, and frowned. Berlin reports the Americans are now using the same engines in long-range escort missions over Germany. Their fighters can reach Berlin and back. Our Luftwaffe allies are demanding we improve our own power plants immediately. The tension in the room thickened. Zapata spoke softly. That's what I've been trying to say. This engine isn't just stronger. It changes strategy. It lets them dictate distance. The moment you can escort bombers to Berlin and back, you no longer fight for survival. You fight for dominance. A long silence followed. Even the colonel said nothing. Finally, General Ruggeri exhaled deeply. You may leave, Engineer Zapata. Your report will be reviewed. Zapata gathered his papers and stood. As he walked toward the door, Mazzini muttered, Engineers talk. Soldiers win wars. Without turning back, Zapata replied, Not anymore, Colonel. Wars are no longer won by courage. They're won by efficiency. He stepped out into the sunlight of the Roman courtyard, his briefcase heavy with copies of his notes. Around him, the city moved as if untouched by war. Street vendors calling out prices, children chasing pigeons. Yet in his mind, one sound echoed louder than all others. The steady hum of those twin Allison engines, whispering a truth the world would soon learn. That the age of mechanical genius had already chosen its champions, and Italy was not among them. The following week, inside the dim offices of the Regia Aeronautica's technical directorate, Engineer Zapata sat alone beneath a flickering lamp. Spread across his desk were dozens of sketches, careful tracings of the P-38's power plant, cross-sections of its turbo supercharger, and detailed notes of the control linkages that allowed independent throttle control. Every pencil stroke was a quiet act of reverence, and perhaps of mourning. He had spent 15 years sketching dreams for Italian aviation, sleek monoplanes powered by engines that never quite reached their promise. But now, in the silence of the ministry's archives, he was documenting the machine that had rendered all those dreams obsolete. The P-38's heart was the Allison V1710, 12 cylinders, liquid-cooled, 3,200 combined horsepower at full throttle. But what truly astounded Zapata wasn't the raw power, it was the consistency. Each component, from the piston rings to the turbine blades, appeared machined with surgical precision. Even the wiring harnesses were wrapped in labeled cloth bands, denoting every connection. It was order made visible. He flipped through one of the captured technical manuals. The Americans had included a checklist for every conceivable failure. Altitude compensation, temperature regulation, mixture control. If detonation occurs, reduce manifold pressure immediately. Zapata smiled faintly. To the Americans, engineering was not art. It was a process. Repeatable, predictable, measurable. He thought of Italy's factories, workers using hand files to finish pistons, technicians relying on intuition instead of instruments. The difference wasn't intelligence. It was philosophy. Just then, his assistant Enrico entered quietly. Engineer, the Germans have requested a copy of your report. They're asking for your sketches. Zapata looked up sharply. The Germans? Yes. Their liaison from Messerschmitt arrived this morning. He says Berlin wants to compare the P-38's power system with the Daimler-Benz 605 engines. Zapata sighed, closing his notebook. Tell them they can see the copy in Rome. Nothing leaves this building. Enrico hesitated. They won't like that. I don't care what they like. Zapata muttered. We've shared enough of our industry already. As Enrico left, Zapata returned to his notes. But the weight of the conversation lingered. Italy was no longer a partner to Germany. It was a subordinate. The Reich dictated what was studied, what was built, and now, what was surrendered. He looked again at the American blueprints. The lines seemed to mock him. Not because they were superior, but because they were finished. The Americans had already achieved what Italy still dreamed about. A system that worked not through improvisation, but through precision. Hours later, a knock broke his concentration. Colonel Mazzini entered, face stern as ever. The Germans insist on viewing your material, Zapata. You'll meet them tomorrow. Zapata frowned. They'll just take it. That's not your concern. Orders from above. When the colonel left, Zapata leaned back in his chair, exhaustion washing over him. He reached for a cigarette, lit it, and stared at the curling smoke. It rose slowly toward the ceiling, spiraling into nothing, like Italy's ambitions. The next morning, 2 German officers arrived at the ministry, crisp uniforms and cold precision in their speech. One introduced himself as Hauptmann Klaus Ritter, an engineer from Augsburg. He examined the P-38's turbo supercharger diagram with visible intrigue. "Remarkable," Ritter murmured. "We are years behind this. Our turbines melt under high load. This runs cool at altitude." Zapata studied the man's expression. "You mean even Germany can't match this?" Ritter gave a tight smile. "We are excellent at innovation. The Americans are excellent at production. They win by repetition." Zapata nodded slowly. "Machines built by machines." Ritter closed the folder. "And that, my friend, is why they will eventually build a machine that leaves the Earth entirely." The words hung in the air. For a moment, Zapata felt an unfamiliar chill. He realized that the P-38 was not the end point. It was the beginning of something far greater. The future of warfare would no longer be fought on wings or propellers. It would be fought with rockets, precision, and the cold logic of industry. As the Germans left, Zapata looked down at his sketches one last time. For the first time in his career, he stopped drawing. What more could he add? The lines before him already told the story, not of a machine, but of a civilization's defeat, written in graphite and steel. The morning sun crept over the rooftops of Rome as engineer Filippo Zapata arrived at the Regia Aeronautica's testing facility. The courtyard was quiet, too quiet, except for the low hum of a generator and the rhythmic footsteps of soldiers on patrol. Today, the Germans would test the captured P-38 engine themselves. Word had spread quickly through the ministry. Berlin had sent their best. Inside the hangar, the air smelled of oil and ozone. The American engine sat mounted on a steel test frame, connected to a crude Italian-made dynamometer. The silver cowling gleamed under the floodlights. It was no longer a mysterious artifact from Sardinia. It was now a weapon of prestige, claimed by both allies and rivals. Zapata stood to the side as Hauptmann Ritter and his assistant prepared the gauges. "Kraftstoffdruck," Ritter muttered, adjusting the fuel pressure line. "We'll see if it runs as well as your reports claim." "It will," Zapata said quietly. Ritter looked up, eyebrow raised. "You sound certain I'm an engineer," Zapata replied. "Numbers don't lie." The German smirked and turned the ignition switch. The Allison V-1710 coughed once, then roared to life. The entire hangar seemed to vibrate, a deep, thunderous growl that rolled through the concrete walls and into the engineer's bones. The propeller shaft spun faster and faster, until the noise became a solid wall of sound. Zapata stepped closer, his clipboard trembling in his hands. The gauges showed perfect readings, oil pressure steady, temperature rising evenly. The turbo supercharger whined like a turbine, building boost effortlessly. Ritter leaned closer to the dial. "Mine got no vibration." Not even at full power, Zapata allowed himself a small smile. "It's balanced like a watch." The German didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the tachometer as the needle climbed higher. The test officer shouted over the noise. "Manifold pressure at 60. Holding!" Suddenly, the lights flickered. The engine's scream filled the hangar, a mechanical roar that drowned out everything else. The Italians stepped back instinctively. Ritter, unfazed, watched in fascination. Then came the smell, faint but unmistakable. Burnt fuel. Zapata's instincts kicked in. "Cut the mixture!" he shouted. But Ritter hesitated, mesmerized by the power. "Noch nicht!" A flash of blue flame burst from the exhaust stack, licking across the wall. The crew scrambled. Zapata lunged forward, grabbing the cut-off lever and yanking it down. The roar collapsed into silence, replaced by the echo of boots and the hiss of cooling metal. The Germans glared. Ritter's assistant snapped. "You interrupted the test!" Zapata turned, furious. "I saved your men. That engine was seconds away from detonation. You overboosted the manifold beyond tolerance." Ritter's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He simply removed his gloves, eyes still on the smoldering Allison. "You Italians lack discipline," his assistant muttered. Zapata met his gaze coldly. "No, we lack factories that can build engines like that." Ritter finally spoke again, softer this time. "Perhaps. But if Germany had built this, the war would already be over." The words lingered. In that instant, Zapata realized the truth Ritter didn't need to say aloud. Even the Germans knew the tide had turned. They were studying relics of their own defeat. Later that evening, after the Germans left, Zapata remained in the hangar. The engine sat quiet now, but its presence still filled the space like a ghost. He touched the cowling once more, feeling the heat radiating from within. For years, Italy had dreamed of building machines that could rival the world's best. engines of power and grace that carried their pilots higher and faster. Yet here it was, perfection, born not in Turin or Milan, but in a Detroit factory halfway across the world. He looked around the dark hangar, where sparks from the generators flickered against the walls like dying stars. The noise of war outside, distant artillery, the rumble of trucks, faded beneath the weight of a single thought. It wasn't bravery or brilliance that would decide this war anymore. It was efficiency. And in that, America had already won. 3 nights after the disastrous test with the German officers, the captured P-38's Allison engine sat silent in the corner of the hangar, its once gleaming cowling now streaked with soot and oil. The excitement had faded. The technicians were gone. Only Zapata remained, and the quiet hum of a ceiling lamp swaying above him. He stood before the engine, hands buried in his pockets, staring at the heart of what had shaken every engineer in Rome to his core. The Germans had left a short report before returning to Berlin. Their conclusion was brutally concise. Impeccable manufacturing. Impossible to reproduce under current European conditions. Those words burned in his mind. Impossible to reproduce. Zapata turned toward his workbench, where pages of his notes lay scattered, sketches of pistons, gear ratios, compressor designs. His handwriting grew more desperate with every line, as if by sheer force of will he could decode the secret inside that American metal. But the truth had already sunk in. The secret wasn't in design, it was in execution. The Allison V1710 wasn't just powerful, it was consistent. Every cylinder, every bearing, every bolt was produced to microscopic precision, then tested, refined, and mass-manufactured in numbers that made Italian production look like handcraft. The Americans hadn't built an aircraft engine, they'd built a system that could build aircraft engines. He flipped through his sketches, pausing at a diagram of an Italian inline engine. Elegant, yes, but delicate, prone to overheating. Impossible to maintain in the field without a team of specialists. The Allison, by contrast, was rugged, engineered to be repaired by mechanics in muddy airfields, with little more than wrenches and fuel oil. He picked up one of the American spark plugs he'd removed earlier. Still clean, still functional after dozens of test runs. He rolled it between his fingers, reading the tiny stamped letters, Champion, Toledo, Ohio, a factory name on a piece of metal that outperformed half of Europe's best engineers. Zapata leaned against the bench, the weight of that realization pressing down on him. It wasn't arrogance that had blinded them, it was pride. Italian engineering had always been about artistry, machines built with soul and style. But war demanded something colder, something America understood perfectly, machines built to endure. Footsteps echoed behind him. Colonel Vittorio Mazzetti, his commanding officer, entered quietly, his cap under his arm. "Still here, Filippo?" Zapata nodded, not looking up. "I wanted to finish the comparative report." Mazzetti stepped closer, his gaze falling on the silent Allison. "The Germans say it's not replicable." "They're right," Zapata admitted. "Even if we copied every part, we couldn't match their tolerances. Our factories can't produce components this precise, this uniform." "Not in these conditions," the colonel sighed. "Then what do you suggest I tell Rome?" "Tell them," Zapata paused, choosing his words carefully. "Tell them we're fighting an army of engineers, not soldiers. Tell them the Americans don't win because their machines are better. They win because every one of their machines is exactly the same." Mazzetti stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "That's a terrifying kind of perfection." "It's also inevitable," Zapata replied. The colonel left, his footsteps fading into the distance. Zapata remained, staring at the engine as the shadows lengthened. Outside, distant thunder rolled, or perhaps artillery fire from the south. He turned back to his notes and began to write one last entry. The Allison engine represents not just superior design, but an entire industrial philosophy. The war will be won by those who can make thousands of perfect parts faster than others can make a dozen beautiful ones. He put down his pen, folded the report, and placed it atop the crate containing the American spark plugs. Then he extinguished the lamp and stepped out into the night. As he walked across the empty airfield, the moonlight reflected off the P-38's metal skin, a pale, silent reminder of a future that Italy and Germany would never reach in time. In that moment, Filippo Zapata understood. The war was already over. It just hadn't been announced yet. Weeks later, the captured P-38 was dismantled and crated for shipment to Berlin. The Germans wanted to study the Allison engine further, though Zapata suspected the effort was pointless. The real lesson couldn't be packed into boxes. It lived in the precision of every bolt, in the consistency of every forged part. From the hangar doorway, he watched the trucks rumble away, each carrying a fragment of a future his country could no longer reach. Around him, the airfield lay silent. Most of the Italian aircraft were grounded, out of fuel, out of parts, out of time. Zapata pulled a small notebook from his pocket. Inside, scrawled in pencil, were the words he couldn't say aloud. "They are building victory in factories while we are still drawing blueprints." He closed the notebook, slipping it away just as Allied bombers passed high overhead, their engines, that same deep, even roar, vibrating the ground beneath his boots. He didn't look up. He didn't need to. He already knew what they were powered by. In the end, the captured P-38 never flew again, but its lessons spread quietly across Italy's defeated workshops. To some engineers, it was humiliation. To others, revelation for Filippo Zapata. It was both. As he left the airfield for the final time, the echo of those distant bombers faded into the night, a mechanical requiem for a generation of dreamers who built with passion, but lost to precision. Years later, when the world began rebuilding, those who studied Zapata's notes would understand what he had seen that summer of 1943. That victory in the modern age would belong not to the boldest designs, but to those who could make perfection repeat itself.